She was 6 years old, and she was waiting for the school bus that never stopped. That's how it would be remembered, forever after, in this story. Not a struggle, not a stranger's car idling at the curb in front of witnesses. Just a girl in a denim jacket, standing at the end of a long gravel driveway on a cold October morning in 1987, in the invented town of Harmon, Nebraska, a small, fictional farming community out on the flat middle of the state, where the horizon runs so straight you can watch weather arrive from 20 miles off. The bus was running 4 minutes late that morning. 4 minutes is nothing. 4 minutes is also, in this story, exactly how long it took for a 6-year-old to vanish from a spot her mother could see from the kitchen window. She never got on that bus. No scream carried across the flat fields. No tire marks in the frost. No struggle anyone could point to, not even the dog next door, who usually barked at anything moving on that road. One moment she existed inside the ordinary cold of an October morning, waiting with her backpack and her lunchbox, and the next, she was simply gone, swallowed into a silence that would stretch on, in this telling, for 39 years. Her name, in this fictional account, was Zoe Campbell. This is not a true story. It is built in the shape of the real cold cases this channel covers, the ones with real names, real families, real answers. But Zoe Campbell exists only here, in this telling, as a way of exploring what a case like this can feel like from the inside. With that said, here's how it goes. Harmon, Nebraska doesn't exist on a map. But if it did, you'd picture it easily enough. One grain elevator visible from every direction. A diner that doubled as the unofficial town hall, and farmhouses spaced so far apart that a neighbor's porch light was sometimes the only other sign of human life, for a mile in any direction. In this story, the land around Harmon was flat cropland as far as the eye could carry. Corn stubble in October. The kind of country where sound travels strangely, and a person can see a truck coming from so far away they have time to guess who's driving it before it arrives. Zoe was the middle child of 3. In this telling, she had 2 missing front teeth, a denim jacket with a rainbow patch her grandmother had sewn on the pocket, and a habit of narrating everything she did out loud, half to herself and half to whoever happened to be nearby. Her mother, in this story we're calling Carol Campbell, worked mornings at the elevator's front office, the kind of job that let her keep half an eye on the kitchen window while she got the other 2 kids ready for the day. Her father, Dale, farmed the 80 acres behind the house his own father had cleared decades before. Up before sunrise most mornings the way farmers everywhere seem to be. It was, in the telling of this story, an unremarkable family in an unremarkable town. A chalkboard by the back door where Carol kept track of chores, a dented pickup that started only on the 3rd try in cold weather. The kind of ordinary, settled life that makes what happens next feel so much crueler by comparison. Nobody in Harmon thought twice about a 6-year-old standing alone at the end of a long driveway waiting on a bus. That was just how mornings worked out there, where the nearest neighbor was a quarter mile off, and everybody trusted the emptiness of the road as much as they trusted each other. That Thursday, October 8th, 1987, around 7:40 in the morning, Zoe walked down the driveway with her backpack and her lunchbox, the way she did every school day, while Carol stood at the kitchen sink watching through the window, the way she did every school day too. The bus was running late. Zoe, in this story, sat down on the culvert at the end of the driveway to wait, swinging her legs, probably narrating the whole morning out loud to nobody in particular. Carol turned to pour a second cup of coffee. It couldn't have been more than 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes at the outside. When she turned back to the window, the driveway was empty. The bus, when it finally rolled up 11 minutes later than usual, found no one waiting at all. In this story, what followed was every parent's worst morning compressed into a single, endless hour. Carol ran the length of the driveway calling Zoe's name until the cold air stripped her voice down to nothing. Dale came in from the machine shed at a dead run, still holding a wrench, not even registering that he still had it in his hand. The bus driver radioed the school before pulling away, and within 20 minutes the fictional Harmon Sheriff's substation had a car on the gravel road, headlights cutting through a morning fog that hadn't burned off yet. By mid-morning, in this telling, half the county was out searching. Farmers who'd normally be in their own fields instead walking dales, neighbors combing the drainage ditches that ran along every property line for miles, a search dog brought in from the county seat 40 minutes away. They searched the grain bins on the Campbell property first, then the neighboring Willett farm, then the culvert itself, the one Zoe had been sitting on, as if the ground might somehow still be holding an answer in the frost. They found nothing, no physical evidence, no footprints beyond her own, going down the driveway and then simply stopping. No tire tracks besides the ones the family's own vehicles left every day. A 6-year-old girl, last seen waiting for a bus a few dozen yards from her own kitchen window, had ceased to exist in less time than it takes to pour a cup of coffee. Investigators in this fictional telling treated it, within the first hour, as exactly what it looked like: a child taken, not a child wandered off. There was no note, no witness, no plausible explanation involving a nearby creek or an unlatched gate. The case made the front page of every paper within 100 miles inside of 3 days, under a headline that would come to define the family's next 39 years: "Girl vanishes from own driveway." The search consumed the county for weeks, and then the surrounding counties too, in this telling. Volunteers walked grid patterns across thousands of acres of harvested cropland, checking grain bins, machine sheds, and culverts for 30 miles in every direction. Search planes flew low over the flat country, scanning fields that offered almost nowhere to hide, and yet somehow still hid her completely. Flyers with Zoe's gap-toothed school photo went up in every diner, feed store, and gas station across 3 counties, and stayed there, sun-bleached and curling at the edges. For years, local churches held a candlelight vigil on the courthouse steps 2 weeks in, the kind of gathering that draws people from towns 40 miles off who'd never met the Campbells, but couldn't stand the thought of a child missing that close to home. Dale, in this telling, stood at the back of that crowd the whole night, without saying a word to anyone, unable to make himself believe a candle could do what a search dog hadn't. And at the end of all of it, in this story, there was nothing. No physical evidence, no credible sighting, no answer anyone could hang the rest of their life on. The active search, in the telling, wound down after 2 weeks, though unofficially, people in Harmon never really stopped looking. Farmers checked their grain bins a little more carefully every fall after that. Hunters walking the drainage ditches each winter kept half an eye out for anything that didn't belong, without ever quite admitting to themselves what they were hoping or dreading to find. Zoe Campbell's file went into whatever passed for a national database in 1987. Grainy photographs mailed to school districts and post offices across the Plains states. A written description of a girl who would, with each passing year, look less and less like the 6-year-old on the flyer, and more like a guess built out of hope. And then, in the telling of this story, the case went cold. Not forgotten. Never forgotten. Not by her family, not by a town that had walked those fields together, but cold in the way only an unsolved disappearance can be. Alive in memory, dead in leads, a wound the whole county carried without ever being given the chance to close it. 39 years is a long time to keep a porch light burning, in the hope that whoever it's for might still be finding their way back. In this fictional account, Carol Campbell never left the farmhouse, even after Dale passed in the story's telling sometime in the 2010s. Even after her other two children grew up and moved to Omaha and Denver. Chasing lives that didn't revolve around a driveway and a culvert and a bus that came 4 minutes late one October morning. She kept Zoe's room largely untouched, not frozen in time exactly, she'd have said, just never quite gotten around to changing. The same faded rainbow bedspread, the same shelf of picture books nobody had opened in decades. 1987 became 1997. 1997 became 2007. Then 2017, each decade widening the gap between the 6-year-old in the photograph and whatever she might actually look like now, if she was out there at all. The grain elevator where Carol once worked changed hands twice. The diner closed and reopened under new owners. A new generation of kids grew up riding that same bus route, without knowing why the Campbell mailbox, alone among all the others on the road, always seemed to have fresh flowers propped against the post every October. The fictional county sheriff's department folded Zoe's case into its own version of a cold case unit sometime in the 2000s, much the way real departments across the plains states genuinely have done with their own long unsolved files. Detectives revisited it every few years, out of a mixture of duty and something harder to name. They ran her information through updated databases as each new system came online. They commissioned an age-progressed photo showing what Zoe might look like at 20, then 30, then approaching 45, each version a little more speculative than the last. Each one filed away without producing a single new lead. By the story's telling, an entire generation of investigators inherited the file the way you inherit a house nobody can quite bring themselves to sell. It sat in a drawer. It got pulled out, reread, and put back again, decade after decade, by detectives who hadn't been born the morning Zoe Campbell disappeared. Somewhere in the middle of all those years, in this fictional telling, the case even drew a small wave of outside attention. A true crime Parcast episode in the early 2020s that Carol agreed to sit for, hoping fresh eyes might turn up something the decades of official searching hadn't. It brought a flood of tips, almost all of them useless. Well, meaning strangers convinced they'd spotted a familiar face in a grocery store 3 states away. None of them led anywhere. Carol, in the story, stopped answering the phone for unknown numbers not long after that, worn down by hope that kept arriving and kept turning out to be nothing. In this fictional version of Harmon, the case became something closer to local memory than an open investigation, the way decades tend to soften even the sharpest griefs into something a small town learns to carry together. Kids who grew up there in the 90s and 2000s knew the story the way you know a piece of local history, half real and half legend. Even though it had happened to an actual family on an actual road they rode past twice a day on the bus. For Carol, in this story, it was never just history. Every October, a handful of the old-timers who remembered walking those fields back in 1987 would still stop by the farmhouse, unbidden, to sit with her for an hour, with nothing new to say. Because that's what a small town does with a grief nobody ever solved. It doesn't let a person carry it entirely alone, even when there's nothing left to do but sit quietly together. The break, in this fictional version of events, came from an ordinary place, a genealogy website and a home DNA kit a cousin had given as a gift one Christmas. The kind that sits in a drawer for the better part of a year before anyone gets around to using it. A woman in this story, we'll call her Renee, Zoe's fictional cousin, close enough in age that the two of them had once shared a bedroom during holiday visits, had spit into the tube out of nothing more than casual curiosity about her own family tree. Months later, the results flagged a distant genetic match to a woman living under a different name several states away. A percentage too specific to explain away as coincidence. Renee brought it to an aunt first, half convinced it was nothing. But the aunt remembered enough of the old story to get curious herself, and together they pulled a shoebox of photographs out of a closet and spent an evening laying a faded school picture of a gap-toothed 6-year-old next to a public records photo of a woman in her mid-40s. The resemblance in the story was impossible to ignore. Something in the set of the eyes had survived 39 years completely intact. They brought what they'd found to the fictional Harmon County Cold Case Unit, half expecting to be gently turned away the way amateur genealogy leads so often are. Instead, investigators, working from Renee's research rather than starting from nothing, the way they'd been forced to for 39 years, reopened Zoe Campbell's file with something they hadn't had since 1987, an actual name and an actual address. They located the woman carefully through channels the department has since declined to detail publicly and approached her gently, aware that whatever they were about to ask her might upend a life she'd spent nearly 4 decades building for herself. They asked if she'd be willing to provide a DNA sample. She agreed. In this fictional telling, the sample collection was almost anticlimactic. A cheek swab in a quiet room, paperwork. A promise that results would take several weeks. The woman at the center of it, according to the story, said very little to the investigators who met with her that day beyond confirming her willingness to cooperate. Whatever she suspected about her own past, whatever she had or hadn't let herself wonder over 39 years, she kept to herself, at least for now. The results came back a match several weeks later, confirmed twice over before anyone was willing to say the words aloud. In this fictional telling, the girl who vanished from a driveway on an October morning in 1987 had spent nearly 4 decades living an entire life under a different name, in a place far from Harmon, Nebraska, with no memory, or no willingness to speak about how exactly she'd gotten there, or who had taken her, or why. Investigators in the story were careful not to speculate publicly about who had taken her, or why, citing an ongoing investigation that could still result in charges. What they could say, in the statement this fictional department eventually released, was simple and in its way enormous. Zoe Campbell was alive. She had been found, and a case that had outlived her father, outlived 2 generations of investigators who'd inherited the file without ever meeting the girl in it, and nearly outlived her mother's own hope, was finally, officially, closed. Carol Campbell, in this fictional account, was 79 years old when she got the phone call, standing at the same kitchen sink where she'd once turned away for less than 2 minutes and lost 39 years in the process. She is said, in the story, that she never stopped setting an extra place at the table on Zoe's birthday, not out of any real expectation, just a habit she couldn't make herself break. Though she also admits that somewhere over the decades, quietly, she'd stopped believing she'd ever get an answer at all, let alone one this strange. The reunion, as imagined in this story, wasn't the tearful movie scene embrace people might expect after 39 years of waiting. It was quieter than that. And stranger, a woman in her mid-40s, meeting a mother she had no memory of, in a farmhouse kitchen neither of them had pictured for 39 years, both of them searching each other's faces for something that might feel like recognition, and finding, mostly, 2 careful strangers trying gently to be kind to each other. Recognition doesn't always look the way it does on a screen. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a mother reaching out to touch a stranger's cheek, just to see if the shape of it still matches the 6-year-old she raised for such a short time, and then spent 39 years remembering. In this telling, Carol kept Zoe's room exactly as it was for 1 more year after that, unwilling to change it even after her daughter was found, as if some part of her still needed the 6-year-old's version of Zoe to exist somewhere in that house, even now that the woman she'd become was at last only a phone call away. There's a version of this story, in the telling, where the woman who used to be Zoe Campbell drives out to Harmon for the first time in 39 years, stands at the end of that same gravel driveway and looks toward a culvert that's still there, weathered but unchanged. In a county that is altered in every way except the one that mattered most to her mother. She doesn't remember the cold that morning. She doesn't remember the bus or the sound of her own mother's voice calling her name across the flat fields. 39 years is long enough to erase almost everything a 6-year-old ever knew. What she does carry, according to the story, is something harder to name. Not memory exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition in her own chest when she finally stands where it all began. The sense that some part of a person's earliest self never quite leaves the ground it was planted in, no matter how far or how long, life carries the rest of her away. That's where this fictional story ends, not with every answer, because real disappearances, even invented ones built to feel real, rarely hand over every answer at once. It ends with a girl who came home as a stranger and a mother who had to learn to love her twice. Once as the child she lost in less time than it takes to pour a cup of coffee, and once as the woman she'd become entirely without her. This has been a fictional story. Zoe Campbell, Carol Campbell, Dale Campbell, Harmon, Nebraska, and every investigator named here are invented, built in the shape of real cold cases to explore what a disappearance like this can feel like, for a family, for a town, and for the version of a person who has to be found twice. Once as a child, and once as the adult she became without anyone's help. If you want the real version of a story like this one, a real family, a real 39-year wait, a real answer, that's still out there too. But this one, start to finish, was never anything but a story.